You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello friends, I'm Dr. T. Michael W. Halcomb, and this is a Greek reading and Greek Growcabulary and Bible in Context episode. So you're going to get all three in this episode today. So after you hear the first, there'll be a little bit of music. You'll hear the second, a little bit of music, and then you'll hear the third. So make sure you stay tuned for all of those. We're going to lead off with, well, I was going to do the Greek reading first, but let's do the Greek let's do the Greek reading first. I was thinking about maybe putting Greek vocabulary first. Let's do the Greek reading first. So we've been reading for a while through Revelation, and we finished Revelation chapter 10 last time, and so we're going to pick up at Revelation 11 today, and we're going to do Revelation 11, 1 to 10. So we'll get the first half of Revelation 11 done today. And if you're watching, I'm going to go ahead and put the Greek text up on the screen. And if you're just listening, that's fine, of course. If you have a Greek Testament and you want to get that out, go ahead and do that. Read along, whatever you're doing. Make sure you're reading along. Read out loud. And you can do that. You can read along with me. You can repeat after me. You can wait till I'm done and read, whatever works for you. But just make sure you get those reading out loud reps in. All right? So here we go. This is Revelation 11, 1 to 10. Και εδόθεμι κάλαμος όμοιους ράβδο λέγον έγειρε και μέτρεσον τον ναόν του Θεού και το θυσιαστέριον και τους προσκυνούντας εν αυτό και την αυλήν την έξωθεν του ναού εκβάλε. Έξωθεν και με αυτήν μετρήσεις ότι εδόθε τους έθνεσιν και την πόλην την Αγίαν πατέσουσιν μένας 42 και δώσω τους διουσίν μαρτουσίν μου και προφετεύσωσιν ημέρας 1200 εξέκοντα περιβεβλεμένου σάκους που του ήσιν δύο ελέε και δύο λυκνίε ενώπιον του Κυρίου της γης εστώτες και ήτης αυτούς θέλει αδικέσε πυρ εκπορεύεται εκ του στόματος αυτών και κατέστη τους εχθρούς αυτών και ητής θελέσε αυτούς αδικέσε ούτως δι' αυτόν αποκτανθένε ούτιου έχουσιν την εξουσίαν κλείσε τον ουρανόν είναι με ιωτός βρέχε τας ημέρας της προφητείας αυτών και εξουσίαν έχουσιν επί των υδάτων στρέφειν αυτά εις αίμα και πατάξει την γην εν πάσε πλεγέ ο σάκης εάν τελέσωσιν και όταν τελεσώσιν την μαρτυρίαν αυτών το θηρίον το ανεβαίνουν εκ της αβιού σου πιουέσει με ταυτόν πόλεμον και νικήσει αυτούς και αποκτηνεί αυτούς. Και το πτώμα αυτών επί της πλατείας της πόλεως, της μεγάλης. Έτης καλείται πνευματικός Σόδομα και Αίγυπτος, όπου και ο Κύριος αυτών εσταυρώθε. Και βλέπωσιν εκ των λαών και φυλών και γλωσσών και εθνών το πτώμα αυτών ημέρας 3 και έμισι και τα πτώματα αυτών ουκ αφίουσιν τεθένε εις μνέμα και οι κατοικούντες επί της γης χαίρωσιν επ' αυτούς και εφραίνονται και δώρα πέμψωσιν αλλέλιους, ότι ούτιου δύο προφέτε ευασάνισαν τους κατιοκούντας επί τες γης. All right, friends. Yes, that is Revelation 11, 1 to 10, and we are going to stop there, but hang out for the Greek Growcabulary segment, which comes up here in just a moment. Right, this is a Greek Growcabulary segment, and today we're thinking about a Greek root that many of you may be familiar with. It's one that's, I guess, is kind of common, although it may not have a high frequency. But for some reason, I think a lot of people know it. And it has some connections to English. It's the Greek root stref, sigma tau epsilon phi, stref, and this has the idea of to turn or to return. Stref. Okay, so we're going to pull up stepbible.org and have a look at where this root occurs. Stref, to turn or return. I think immediately of strep, throat. That's terrible when it returns. I kind of also think when I hear stref, I think of Steph Curry. He shoots that shot and he turns and goes before it even goes in. So those are two mnemonic devices if you want to use them for thinking about that Greek root. So I have stepbible.open. I got my keyboard set to Greek. I'm going to type in stref and we'll do a quick search here. There we go. You can see that strefo, the verb, occurs 21 times, meaning to turn. It can also mean to change or repent, to turn one's life, to twist, to make a change, to turn oneself about, to change direction, so on and so forth. Pretty interesting. So you can see that the first occurrence of this appears in Matthew 5:39. We have strepson, and that phi will change to a psi when you have like here we have an aorist active imperative, so that sigma when it meets the phi, when the sigma meets the phi, or when the phi meets the sigma, you get the psi, right? In Matthew 7:6 we have the participle strafendes. And in Matthew 9:22, o de Jesus strafis, Jesus turned, ke idon, aftein ipen, and looking at her said, in Matthew 16:23, o de strafis ipen to Petro, well, the one turning said to Peter, Yupaye o piso mu satana, get behind me, accuser, or Satan. And then we have Matthew 18:3, so a lot of these in Matthew strafete, Matthew 27:3, estrepsin. A few instances in Luke, strafis. Actually, it's all the same exact form in Luke, strafis. So lots in Matthew, lots in Luke, but in Luke, only that one form, evidently. It's the same form you find in John's Gospel, in 138, strafis, but you have several other forms later on, strafosin, estrafe, strafisa, and then in Acts, interesting, we don't see the straphi again, we see estrafisan and then estrapsin, so I would have expected that we would see the same thing, strephometha, and then in Revelation we have one occurrence, strephin, which we just read in chapter 11. So, this has the idea to turn, so stref, again, Steph Curry, he shoots that, turns and runs, but you got to remember the row there, Steph Curry. Or like strep throat when it returns is terrible. So that is our Greek Growcabulary segment. I want you to hang out next because we have the Bible in context coming up, and you're going to love that episode. So hang on here, and you'll hear that come up in just a moment. All right. Hope that helps.
All right, man. So last time we talked about the creation as temple and future temples and tabernacles as patterns of the Garden of Eden, of the initial creation. And now I think we should talk about Genesis 1 as the Exodus. I think we should talk about how the Exodus motif shows up in Genesis 1, because that is going to be important throughout the entire book and will set us up to see how the narrative develops a little more plainly.
Yeah, that sounds great. I really enjoyed our conversation last time as we just kind of saw this theme of a temple come full circle from Genesis, where you've got the temple, God's cosmic temple overlapping on the mountain of the Garden of Eden, and then after the fall, at some point that was removed, and so there was a separation between the heavens and earth, and then you've got the temple and the tabernacle as being kind of microcosms or patterns or small versions of the heavenly temple here on earth. But then you get to Revelation finally, and we are back to where we started with the Garden of Eden, where the heavens have now again overlapped with the earth. And it's just a beautiful story that you see throughout Scripture.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so what we're going to see as we talk about the Exodus in the creation account, there's a lot of literary connections between the Exodus of Israel and the creation of the world. So much so that we're supposed to read these two stories in tandem, supposed to see the creation as sort of a preliminary Exodus in a sense, or at least Yahweh using the same means to create as he does to deliver his people, and also to create a new people, to bring Israel out of Egypt, to separate them from Egypt, and then create them into a new entity, which will now be his kingdom of priests.
All right, so what are some of the similarities between the Exodus motif and the creation story? What's step one?
Yeah, so the first thing is in Genesis 1, verse 2 and verse 6. First we see Yahweh's spirit, his ruach, the breath of God, and the separating of waters. The same words are used together. Then in Exodus 14:21, we see an east wind, an east ruach, which, again, we talked about east last time with the temple, the garden faces east, suggesting that this might be a ruach that is from God or from his dwelling. And then we see the waters separated. In this case, it's the Red Sea or the Red Sea.
So it's this idea of bringing them out of chaos too,
absolutely.
Bringing order to the chaos, and like separating the waters, and the Spirit of God, the breath of God. Yeah,
and that's the next thing, is because we see how the sea, or we've talked about before, how the sea is associated with Yahweh's enemies.
Right.
And so here, well, even in Psalm 74, you divided the sea and crushed Leviathan. Those concepts are associated. So here the sea is divided and restrained. The elements of ruin are restrained. In Exodus 14:21, for instance.
Yeah, we said, so Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back, a strong east wind all night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided.
Yeah, and then in verse 28, those waters come back in and destroy the chariots and the horsemen and all of Pharaoh's army. And so we see Yahweh, again, defeating his enemies here in the same way that he restrains the ruin in creation. So then, as these, going back to the waters when they part, in Genesis 1:9, the dry land appears. Also in Exodus 14:21, again, dry land appears. Then a new humanity is brought out of these separated waters. In Genesis 1:26, again, we have a new humanity created, or Genesis 2 verse 7, that's where humanity is created in that chapter. And then in Exodus 19:4-5, we're not explicitly told that Israel is a new creation in those terms, but we've talked about how that functional ontology concept, how the way that Yahweh creates is not by, zapping atoms into being, but by separating out something from something that is in a state of ruin and then molding it, changing it, making it into something good. And here he has taken Israel out of the ruin of Egypt, their oppression there, brought them through the waters, just like he did in Genesis 1, and then he has set them aside and commissioned them to be his treasured possession, to be his nation of priests. They are now a new nation, a new creation.
So this is interesting. In chapter 15 of Exodus, there's a song that Moses is singing here after they've gone through the Red Sea. And in verse 13, you have led in your steadfast love, your hesed, the people whom you have redeemed. You have guided them by your strength to your holy abode. And so into his presence.
Yeah, definitely. And that is going to be picked up again later in the Torah. And we're going to see that continue, the idea of God creating a people and bringing them to himself.
The word in Hebrew is Naweh, and it can mean grazing place. Kind of get a garden image a little bit.
That's interesting. Okay, yeah. That's cool. Actually, I hadn't looked at that.
Can mean like pasture. It's translated pasture several times.
That was definitely a good point. But the new creation idea, at least, you see that again. You see it in, I think it's just interesting to bring up Isaiah 43 because he talks about there in verse 1, but now thus says Yahweh, he who created you, O Jacob, he who formed you, O Israel, fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. So it's going back through, again, recalling some of this Exodus imagery, and whether he's referring directly to the Exodus event or not, he sees Yahweh as creating and forming Israel. Again, by taking them out from one people and designating them as a new entity who he has redeemed and set aside, called by name, and given a new purpose. Really having an understanding of that functional ontology, I think, helps to see some of these new creation events that may have been a little more clear to the original audience. So now that we have our new humanity created, in Exodus 15, do you remember Exodus 15, verse 17?
Sure. You will bring them in and plant them on your own mountain, the place, O Lord, which you have made for your abode, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. There's that word abode again.
Yeah. So he's bringing them into his temple. So now that he's created this new humanity, in Genesis 2:15, he takes Adam and rests him, puts him, nuachs him in the garden. Exodus 15:17 talks about also Israel being brought into Yahweh's abode. It's not the same word there for put or rested, but you do see it in Deuteronomy 11:8-12 or Joshua 21:44. There's this idea of, again, as Israel is brought out of Egypt through the waters, they're then nuach, rested in Canaan, in God's promised chosen land where he is going to dwell.
And isn't that the same word that's used to describe God resting on the seventh day in his temple when we get to, like, is it Deuteronomy? Exodus 20:11.
Yeah, so, Yahweh also nuachs after he makes creation in Exodus 20. We should have had that verse a couple weeks ago.
That would have been helpful.
Yeah. No, that was good to remember, though. So we've also talked about, again, the creation of the temple already in Genesis 1. Obviously, half of Exodus, chapters 35 through 40, are consumed with the construction, the building of the tabernacle, God's temple, the place where he's going to dwell. So, again, you have that correspondence, the creation of a temple is involved, and then humanity is rested in his dwelling. There's also the blessing of that humanity to be fruitful and multiply. You have that in Genesis 1:28 applied to the first humans, and then in Leviticus 26:3-11 and Deuteronomy 11:7-16, it's applied to Israel. And I know that maybe it's confusing saying, talking about Leviticus and Deuteronomy, those are not the book of Exodus. They're not close necessarily to the story of Exodus. But you got to remember, once Israel comes out of Exodus, the rest of the Torah is their story of them getting into the promised land, getting into Canaan. So that whole segment is one big Exodus cycle. And so the the themes and imagery that run through that entire section are part of the Exodus motif that we see here in Genesis 1. Really, the author has taken a lot of these themes and compressed them down from the other 4 books of the Torah into Genesis 1. And he'll do it elsewhere as well in Genesis, we'll see. So, also humanity, they act as priests. We see that again in Genesis 2:15. Exodus 19, we see Israel is commissioned as a kingdom of priests. They're each given a command. Humanity is not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in Genesis 2:16 through 17. And in Deuteronomy 30:15, they are commanded.
Yeah, see, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God.
So, I mean, there we have both of them are given a command based on good and evil, Tov and Ra, on pain of death.
Yeah. So, he goes on to say even, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life that you and your offspring may live.
Yeah, and then, one more correspondence is the covenant aspect and the marriage aspect. So, in Genesis 2:22 through 25 is essentially the marriage of...
Yeah, the man and the woman. And there's covenant language here, right?
Yeah, there's absolutely that covenant language of, this is the last bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. That is familial language. We see it whenever, like, Laban applies that to Jacob. You're surely my bone and flesh, or...
Yeah, you're now my family.
Yeah. So, that's a declaration that they are now
my
family.
Flesh and blood.
And Adam takes Eve to be his wife. Now, that's significant because reflecting on the Sinai covenant, the prophets will look back and look at that as the marriage between God and his people. If you see actually in Ezekiel 16, it's very explicit that he talks about he saw this baby who was dying in its own blood, and he picked it up, took it out of Egypt, and dressed it and nurtured it, took care of it, and then finally he married this girl when she came of age, and that is a depiction of Sinai. He gave her all these ornaments, which is the wisdom of the law, and just all these correspondences with Sinai. So it's significant that, first of all, there's a covenant there, and there's also a covenant at Sinai. Maybe that's kind of a loose correspondence, but I think it is significant that the prophets later reflect on the Sinai event as a marriage between Israel and God. And backing that up even further is, so there's another book called Hidden But Now Revealed by Benjamin Glad and G.K. Beale. And that book goes through the meaning of the word mystery as it's used in the Bible. So the word mystery in the Bible is used to describe something that was always true but hidden. It's referring to, for instance, Paul in Ephesians says that the mystery of marriage is that marriage corresponds to Christ and the church. The husband and the wife correspond to Christ and the church. He calls that a mystery. He's not saying, this is a cool little analogy that I found. He's actually telling his audience that the Bible intended for us originally to see the covenant between man and woman in Genesis 2 as corresponding to Yahweh's covenant with humanity and with Israel later in the Bible. And so Paul, at least, it seems that he believes that we are supposed to read Genesis 2, that marriage, as connected to the marriage of Yahweh and his people. It's not just an interesting analogy, but it's actually something inherent within the text. That might even be why we're told that the man is supposed to leave his father and mother and go to the woman, when that is not the cultural case at all. But we do have God coming to his people, and then Jesus coming to his people, repeatedly throughout Scripture. So that may not be the case, but it's interesting to consider. Now, that's kind of where the Exodus motif ends here, except for a couple more correspondences that ideally wouldn't be there, and that is the fall. So after all this, they're given this command of good and evil on pain of death. both Israel and the first humans receive these commands, but then they both fail to keep those commands. Adam and Eve listen to the serpent, and they take of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Israel, immediately after coming out of the Exodus, they start worshiping an idol. And then also you can follow that to later in their history, where they continue to fall and to rebel against Yahweh and to choose evil and death instead of life and good. And ultimately this results in not death, but Adam and Eve being exiled east, their fruitfulness being frustrated. Adam has to work the ground now. The childbearing process is going to be different and more difficult now. And very similar language is used in Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28, about how if they rebel, their fruitfulness will be frustrated. They won't have children the same way. Their crops won't bear much fruit. Their flocks will be less productive, and then they will be invaded and killed and exiled. Then you get to places like 2 Kings 17 or Micah 1, and you see that Babylon, which is east of Israel, come and they wipe out Israel and Judah, and they exile them east. So what we have, let me just run through these correspondences very quickly, just to give us a high-level view of the correspondences between the Exodus and the creation. We have the Ruach of God and dark waters that are separated. The ruin and the enemies of God are restrained and defeated. Dry land appears. A new humanity is created. A temple is created. Those people are then rested in Yahweh's dwelling, in his garden. They are blessed to be fruitful and multiply. They are commissioned to subdue. They act as priests. They are given a marriage and a covenant, and then they are given commandments regarding good and evil, life and death, and they are told to keep those commandments lest they die. Well, they go ahead and break those commandments, and they are, instead of dying, they are exiled, and their fruitfulness is frustrated. So, again, I hope it's clear enough that the author intends for us to read these stories together and to see the creation really not only as an act of creation, but as Yahweh's first Exodus act. The creation and the Exodus are not separable events, but creation is part of Exodus.
Yeah, and it sets us up at the end of the day for Jesus as the new Moses, bringing his people into the promised land.
Yeah, absolutely. Helping us to pass through the same ruin and chaos that he did, from life to death, and be brought to be rested in his temple. Yeah, yeah. And that's
and what does he call the church? His bride, right? And so,
right.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of correlations to Christ.
Yeah, and
good stuff.
We won't have that ending on the end where there's the rebellion and all that. So that's where the Exodus motif will end in the end.
Yeah, yeah. Good. I love it.
So we'll see this show up again later in Genesis, but for now, just let that help you read this story and have some coherence in it. And then we'll go back through, and since we kind of breezed over chapter 2 and chapter 3 in discussing this, we'll go hit some high-level points in those chapters, and then continue on with the book of Genesis.
Sounds like a plan.
All right. Talk to you later.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.